Hi, everyone, and welcome to the first of the discussion panels of Quantum Eastern Europe. It is a pleasure for me to introduce three people that I appreciate very, very much. We have Christoph Jurzak from Quantum Nation. Hi, Christoph. We have Emily Meads from Speedinvest. Hi, Emily.
Hi.
And David Shaw from Fact-Based Insight. Thanks, David. Okay, so we are going to talk about investment in general in quantum technologies, and also we want to discuss the investment in quantum in Eastern Europe. So first, I would like all of the panelists to introduce themselves, a little bit of the history, how they ended up working in quantum and how they see investment in general. And then we dip into the questions. And I ask everyone to use the chat and the Q&A on the right-hand panel to ask any questions. So, Christoph, we can start with you.
Yes, thank you very much, and thanks for having me. Very happy to have this conversation today. So I'm Christoph Jurzak. I'm a physicist by training. I did a PhD in the field of cold atoms physics 25 years ago already. And back in 2018, actually, I started a fund dedicated to quantum technologies and physics. We're based in Paris and Boston now. The fund is closing, well, it's a technical term, but essentially we're finishing our fundraising at about 90 million euros at the moment. And the fund is dedicated to early stage companies. So from essentially incorporation, and we'll talk about that later, I'm sure, incorporation to early growth, let's say, Series A, Series B. We have made 20 investments in the space all over the world, in Europe, in the US, and in Canada, in quantum computing, sensing, communications, and also something a little bit different that we call deep physics. It's very much the same, let's say, but a little bit less quantum, less entanglement, less implication, like photonic computing, for example. That's also something that's very interesting. So technically, I think we are the largest investor in the field of quantum technologies by number of participation, if not by amount. Yeah, happy to share our experience, especially how to start projects, how to get from a university to building a successful company that's ready for funding and fundraising.
Thanks, Christoph. Emily, would you like to be next?
Yes, thanks, Araceli, for having me. I'm also super happy to be here today. So how did I end up in quantum? I also have a background in physics. I used to work on 2D materials and semiconductors, and more recently focused a little bit more on quantum technologies on the software side. So I am a deep tech investor at Speedinvest. We're also an early stage investor, and I'm part of what we call our deep tech team. And my main focus as part of this team has been around quantum technology. So I've shaped our investment thesis around this. And since then, we've made 2 investments in the space with Quantum Nation. So we work quite closely together on these deals. And these are on the quantum communication side. So a QKD company called KETS out of Bristol, and a company called QphoX out of Delft, which is working on interconnect. So to convert from the microwave to the optical regime and back. But in general, we look at all facets of quantum technologies, whether it's on the software or on the hardware side. So like Christoph said, sensing, communication, horizontal enable technologies, also on software and hardware. And our focus is mainly in Europe, with the opportunity to look kind of across the globe as well. But Europe is kind of our home territory, let's say. And yeah, we definitely plan to continue making investments in the space. I think it's only the beginning. And I will also continue to look at these kind of investments within our company. So that's a little bit of a background on me and Speedinvest and what we've done so far. And I'll hand over to, I guess, David now to introduce himself. So thanks.
Hi, I'm David Shaw. My original background also a PhD in physics, and I can't confirm or deny how many years ago that was, quite some time. Then management consulting for a number of years, then 2 startup and growth businesses, which was all great fun. I've been using fact-based insight to get really up to speed with what's happening across the quantum community and offer that quantum market advisory service. One of the reasons for doing that has always been an interest in getting into investment. And with 3 partners in Coherence Ventures, we're now starting a quantum technology investment venture, which is, and you might say it is, a lot of people say, oh, like what Quantum Nation have done. And of course, it is indeed a homage to Quantum Nation, but I think it's a very big field, and I think it can't be that Christoph and Emily get to own just everything in the sector. So I think there's room for a lot of different voices.
Thanks, David. So we hear a lot about spinning out from university and then growing. Let's start step by step. So when people have an idea or they think about commercialization, or when someone like maybe one of you go to university and say, what you're doing is really cool, you could commercialize that. How could people at the university start thinking about spinning out and think about pre-seed or seed investment? So let's go step by step. Christoph, your thoughts?
Yeah, so there are different ways. It depends also very much on the geography, I must say. Something that to me is really important, that there is an established ecosystem. That means a network of people who work towards helping companies being created, funded, and grow. When it's inexistent, and I think that might be a challenge in Eastern Europe, it's more difficult. In some places like Sherbrooke in Quebec, for example, the province of Quebec is very active on quantum. They have structured it in a way that it's relatively easy, quote unquote, for projects to turn into companies, because there are shared infrastructures, for example, where they can use dilution fridges as a service in order to get things tested before going to the next phase. And there are investors, several investors who are kind of networked and that who are looking at the projects together. When this is, and it happens elsewhere, it's the case in Delft, for example, in the Netherlands, in Paris, in the UK, several ecosystems. When it doesn't exist, it's more difficult, to be honest, because you're a little bit on your own. And it's much more difficult to connect with the right-minded, with the right people, investors in particular, to find them even and to approach them and to get to start. And the second challenge is that some universities, because most of the companies we invest in are spin-outs from universities, and sometimes universities they are not either active, interested, or quite the contrary, they can be an obstacle even sometimes, quite frankly, to spinning out companies. So it's important to get connected with them, but it's important also to be a little bit independent and have one's own project and to develop it. I'm thinking about the project that we started, that we had fun. I mean, probably we got the approval from the university 2 years after it was already incorporated and we had done the first funding, actually. So you need to push things a little bit, be dynamic. If you play only by the book in some situations, that just doesn't work. So depends very much on the situation. But as for ourselves, so what we like to do is, I tend to say that, well, if we invest in early stage, and that's what we do, that's our job, better to invest very early, like really at the beginning, talking to researchers who have a project. So not necessarily researchers, especially in software, sometimes it's less connected to academia, can be more of a private initiative, let's say, but talk to them early. Now with 20 or 19, 20 projects under the hood, there are to-dos and not to-dos that we know, things about mistakes with cap tables, with IP, several other things. It's better to talk relatively early. But I will not hide also that there are not many investors, and I'm totally with David here. I mean, there's plenty of space for people to come in and invest in quantum technologies. There's a scarcity of investors, especially in the early stages. So at the end of the day, if you're looking in Europe at who is investing in this space early, maybe there are 10 investors who are able to do that, are in a position to help you get the projects started. So it's not that big. So in a sense, then it makes it easier to connect maybe, but still, I think that's a challenge. But we like to connect early, even when projects are not fully baked, to be honest. It takes time, but that's a job. I mean, that's what we do. And then we help the companies grow. It takes time. That's something to keep in mind. My view, usually when I say that from the first connection with let's say a lab or people who want to get into entrepreneurship to the moment when we incorporate or start the company, usually it's 1 to 2 years. So it takes time because there are many things to do. I mean, and it's really a journey more than a race, to be honest. And people should keep that in mind. It's not immediate. I mean, like it's just not happening overnight, and people need to know how to survive in this phase, of course. So that's one challenge. But a couple of challenges. It sounds very difficult, but it happens. We have invested in many companies in Europe, but there are ways to go, but it's not streamlined completely yet. How to do it, how to work on that, how to create a company. It's quite artisan style, I say. So you have to deal with that.
Thanks, Christoph. I understand, Emily, that you are actually doing that. You're trying to understand what researchers are doing in the lab and see what could be commercially available. How is your journey here? What are your thoughts here?
I think it takes a pretty deep understanding of the field, and I can't pretend to know everything that there needs to be known about quantum computing. I think that's impossible for one person to know how to do. But I think looking at the field from kind of like a holistic perspective and a high view to understand where there are bricks missing to kind of enable the building of larger projects. So for example, the holy grail of quantum computers, on the communication side, on the sensing side, like all of these have small bits that need to come together in a structured and coherent way. And I think, thinking about this from like a high perspective is definitely something that helps. So when you're looking at, for example, an enabling technology, it might seem like there's a direct commercial application, so you have one piece of the puzzle. Okay, this is something that's needed to build a quantum computer, but is it something that's going to be needed when quantum computers are scaling up, when quantum computers are commercially available? Is it going to impact things if the computer is accessible via the cloud, or if everyone has their own computer at home? So thinking about how these different technological bricks fit into the bigger picture, I think is quite important to, thinking about how the project can scale and grow, potentially commercially or potentially not. There's also ways to commercialize things without necessarily like starting a startup and being the CEO behind this company. You can work with other commercial entities and license your technology, for example. So really thinking about, I think, the bigger picture, how it can scale in the long term, and if this is something that can grow within like the ownership of an individual company. And I think at the moment there's a lot of technology that's popping up that's definitely crucial and enabling, but the question is like, is this something that fits into like the venture capital model, let's say, which is a very different thing, and there are very like stringent requirements that make the venture capital model work. So I think that's definitely something important. And just to feed on what Christoph was saying, like support from an ecosystem is super, super important. And I think if you don't have that directly around you, I would definitely encourage you to go look in ecosystems that are more well set up and, ask around about what is the typical way to structure like your company or your cap table, or how much ownership is normal for you to have in the earliest stage of spinning out. What should belong to the university, what doesn't, what can you use from the university that you have around you as well. Like it's not necessarily a good thing at all to cut ties completely in the early stage from the setting that you're in. So just step back, look at how it can grow, and think about what it means like for this to fit in a venture capital model. I think would be some things to think about.
Thanks, Emily. So both of you, Christoph and Emily, have mentioned that knowledge, awareness, and education is important. David, do you think that that's maybe the case, that there are not so many investors in the space? You think that just people don't understand quantum enough? You think that there is a lot in order to... I think you have made a fantastic work on understanding all the different pieces of the puzzle in the quantum ecosystem. But still, it seems that a lot of investors in general, they don't have this deep knowledge. Or do you think that they are not interested? How do you see this from this overview perspective?
Yeah, I think it is a real challenge. There's something about quantum which makes it unusually challenging for the non-expert to start to try to dig down and get beneath the surface on. In contrast to other technologies where a generally educated technical person would be able to orient, they would feel able to go and read themselves into a subject. There's something about the mystique, sometimes the undeserved mystique, sometimes actual conceptual points that you have to have a framework for putting there's something about that makes it challenging for a wider investment community. And so I do think it's important that you can have individual funds, sources of information, sources of bridging insight that goes between what can be a very narrow and deep technical world at the academic level and actually what has to be a much broader set of skills and components to bring together an end-to-end product. And I really think I would echo some of the thoughts Emily made. It's not that any one individual can go and somehow be deeply on top of it, what's happening in all of these very specialist, highly specialist areas. That just is not real world. But what certainly I've been trying to do in fact-based insight is more sensibly relate the pieces of the jigsaw together in a way that lets you work and understand the touch points, the potential conflicts, the potential synergies between what are otherwise deep and specialist areas. And I think that's needed, to be honest, by a whole series of players around the ecosystem. It's needed just by people building their businesses. It's needed by people selecting people they'll partner with in the businesses. And I absolutely think it's needed by investors that need to understand when some particular piece of the puzzle comes up, what bit of the puzzle are they investing in? And to be honest, you can play that back, and this is something I know Christoph understands. You can look at that quantination portfolio, and it's very nicely putting together pieces from across that wider ecosystem, and that's I think that's going to be good.
Thank you. So far we have been talking of people that are thinking about signing out for universities. So the first step. What I have heard in other panel discussions, as the one from today, is that there is a lot about early investment in Europe, but there's not so much when companies want to grow. So there's a point that, you spin out, you have seed funding, people start to know about what you're doing, but then you need to really develop your product, and then you need more funding. And then it's when there is kind of a wall in Europe to go from that seed funding to say Series A, Series B, we are big enough, we are competitors from all the biggest companies in the other side of the ocean. Do you think this is the case? What are your thoughts in general when thinking about the next steps for funding? How do you see the ecosystem? Let's start with David here.
Yeah, there's a piece here that I just like to talk about, the conceptual challenge for a moment here. One of the things to realize about investors and pools of investment capital is that they naturally have different time horizons and different risk expectations for what they want to get involved with. So what a seed investor, what motivates them, what they're looking to get back is maybe different to what an early stage venture capitalist would be looking for. There's something different again about mid-stage institutions, and there's something different again about public markets. Each of these different sources of capital, which are needed by businesses at different scales of their development, they grow to have different expectations for how long they're willing to invest before seeing a specific return, the level of return they need to offset the risk they're taking. And so one of the things to always understand in dealing into any of those pools is what the expectation of that pool is. And in particular, one set of investors, it's not necessarily that they should invest through the lifetime of a business. They need to exit, and that's not a bad thing. It's not that they don't want your business to go on growing. They need to exit because actually you've moved beyond the stage that they're specialized in. Now, apologies, to get back to your question, you've got this nascent scene where, yes, we can have seed investors when we've got early stage venture investors in Europe. One of the challenges of going to that mid stage is that it naturally works better across a wider geographic area. And that's where the US has had an advantage, because its capital markets have been able to coalesce like that. And unfortunately, I think in Europe at the moment, at that mid stage, we're in danger of focusing too much on a narrow national sovereignty lens, which makes it more difficult to mobilize those mid-stage pools of capital. And I also think it's a concern in the quantum sector that one solution, rushing into public quotations, has serious downsides.
Very powerful statements. Christoph, how do you see these from your portfolio of the 19 to 20 companies?
Yeah, to piggyback first on David's comment, I think it's really important for aspiring entrepreneurs to understand that investors are not all the same, venture capital investors. It's very clear if you're starting a company and you try to talk to a growth investor, somebody who specializes more in later stages will not work. I mean, you don't have the basic criteria they're looking at for making investments. So you really should focus and talk to the people who have expertise in early stage funding, who are interested in that. Else, I think it's really, frankly, waste of time and for everybody involved. And sometimes the worst is that some investors, they don't even say it right completely clearly from the start. And that's, I think, also something that's a challenge for companies. So they really should focus on identify investors, what they're doing, are they a good fit for their projects, and then go into deep conversations. But growth. So actually, yeah, we have realized that's definitely an issue. So we are investing in Europe and in the US. So I see a situation very differently. In a way, I'd say it might sound strange, but I think it's. I'm thinking about France, in particular, but also Germany or UK. In a way, I think for deep tech and quantum, it's even easier to start companies and projects in Europe than it is in the US. For a couple of reasons, but you can find very decent grants opportunities in Europe that you don't necessarily have in US or Canada. Canada is a bit tricky as well, and there's not necessarily such a huge pool of investors. These investors are ready to bet on early stage investment in an organized way. In the US, it tends to be more family offices who put some money at the early stage, necessarily very well organized funds. So it's not necessarily easy for startups, and I've looked at many startups in the US as well, and I can tell you that Europe is very good, in my view, is very well positioned for early days. Where it turns difficult is really Series B plus, like when the company starts to scale. And all governments, I think, and the European Commission have realized that it's called scale up. I think there are several initiatives about that, but definitely. And we're talking about very different things, but capital requirements for quantum computing are in the hundreds of millions that you need to raise, for sure. I mean, in order to bring a company to maturity. For sensing, quite different. I mean, companies can mature faster. Markets are smaller also on the other end. So maybe you can't, I don't know, 50 million up to 100 million, something like that. So that's something that's more doable, let's say. But definitely, as of today, fundraising for a quantum computing hardware company in Europe is very, very challenging. And there are not many investors who have the capability to do that because they lack the due diligence expertise. We've been told that several times. And you need a lead investor, somebody who understands the technology, can put a valuation on the company. And then once you have one lead, actually, all the offers come in. I mean, it's like you can fill up your round relatively fast, but you need one who has a deep technical conviction. And there are not many investors like that in Europe. So much so that actually, so as I told you, we have this 90 million fund. We're doing a final closing. We're starting working on what's called an opportunity fund, which is a growth fund, actually much bigger. That's here precisely to invest in follow-up rounds after Series B and beyond, so that we give these companies the possibility to have money from Europe invested and eventually syndicate other investors. But at this stage, for quantum computing hardware, definitely, I think it is a challenge. We will see that over the next 2 years because companies like IQM, Pascal, EQT, others are coming now actually to the market. It's a bit, there's 1 to 2 years delay with what has happened in the US with IonQ and Rigetti, and we'll come to that, I'm sure. But so there's slight delay. 2 years later, they'll need hundreds of millions and they need to find them. Else, they will not be competitive and they will not grow. And at this stage, that's super challenging, I think.
Thank you. So, Emily, I understand that the only possibility then to get to the hundreds of millions is to work together, different VC partners with each other and have a lead. How do you see this? Do you agree with David and Christophe's comments?
I do. I think they both gave quite complete answers on the questions. Yeah, I think this is also an issue that's not specific to quantum, but yeah, some technology companies in Europe in general and in deep tech. Yeah, again, this conflict between sort of national incentives and European incentives, it has a lot of benefits, but also challenges, in particular in the later stages. But no, to be honest, I think Christophe and David answered this quite well, so I won't say too much on it.
Emily, when you're looking to invest in a quantum company, what is the first thing that you look at? Some people, and I'm gonna answer from other investors that I have in other panels, they said it's the team. They said the most important is the team. So team is not the answer that I'm looking here. What else do you think when you are looking for investment in quantum?
One thing is always tricky to narrow it down to. I would say a combination of the team and the technology. I think that especially in the early stages, there's a couple of approaches. You can either really go seek out like leaders in a certain field and a certain topic. Look at their publication records, see what kind of lab they're running around them, look at the hub that's around them, and then behind that person, look for the technology, right? So you look for a specific thing that you know is missing in the market, or you can do it the other way around and look for the people first. So, I mean, in such a technical field, I have to say that the IP and what's actually being built is definitely crucial. But behind that, the technology on its own, like we've said, isn't going to do anything. Like it's not going to move out of the academic lab on its own, and you need people to push that. So I think it's a combination of technically defensible IP, so that you're protected from other people kind of moving into your territory, and the ability for a team to execute and have genuine sort of motivation to turn it into a commercial product. So I'm sure a lot of people give answers like this, but I think it's a mix of different things. And of course, if you have an ecosystem around you, that's a plus. If you're thinking about scaling from day one, that's a very big plus too, because again, like a lot of things can change between building just one product and many versions of this product, especially when you have to integrate with quite, complicated, maybe not complicated, but well-established manufacturing chains. You need to have a very good understanding of how this is going to slot into existing, ecosystems and things that are set up. So yeah, I definitely didn't give you one thing there, but I think it's a mix of a lot of them.
Thanks, Christoph. Would you like to complete Emily's answer?
Yeah, so one thing that's really important for us when I'm asked about why we invest and what's the trigger, it's the really first thing we invest in is the science. And it's amazing. And I think something I'd like to insist on. So we hear a lot about hype these days in quantum. And there's a couple of reasons for that. But one very specific challenge that David mentioned earlier in this sector is really the barrier to entry in terms of knowledge and understanding. So even of the basics actually of the technology. So that it's relatively easy to hear and willingly or not, let's say, hype things a little bit too much. And that's a mistake for all parties involved, of course. So what we try to do in our investment thesis is balance short-term, long-term. There are definitely some investments that we're making that are bets on the long-term, and I'm aware of that, and I know that, and we're conscious about that. And there are some of the things we do that are much shorter term, and we expect returns and profitability much faster. But so understanding the horizon for these applications, I think, is really fundamental. And that's why one of the first things we do is really get into the science at the beginning, see that the team behind the company has true peer-reviewed science. And it's surprising the amount of, I would say, stupidities or let's say BS, I didn't say the word, but people are telling you when they're bringing a project, of course, it doesn't make any sense. You don't even need sometimes to be a physicist, but it's better also. Sometimes you really need expertise and to be a physicist to understand. But what's amazing is that really it's difficult and challenging to have this idea, to form this view on the horizon. But that's absolutely necessary from the start. You need to. Physics is hard. I always say you need to understand if people are telling you about a 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, frankly, time horizon, or within the next years. And there's a big mix there. So people confuse concepts. And at the end of the day, it's super damaging to the sector as a whole. But I'm really deeply convinced there are things to do in the short term in this sector. Else we wouldn't be here investing in startups, obviously. But there are also huge confusions. And that's something you have to understand from the start, because there's poor education on investors on quantum in general. And that's work to be done also by the ecosystems, but really from the start, assess the horizon and the challenges for the project that's brought to us, is really a number one factor and assessment that we're doing.
Thanks, fully agree. I think it's
do you mind if I just
go jumping. Sure.
I just wanted to emphasize Christoph's point, because I think it's actually a more distinctive point than I think some of the audience might realize. It's very common to sit down and venture capitalists will say, oh no, it's all about the team. And I mean, a lot of this industry, it comes from a background where the technology basically works, and maybe it is more about the team. But if you have a part of a team, at least it's one of the things the venture capitalists can do is help work to complete that team and bring in the other skills. If the science isn't going to work, or the science isn't going to work for 10 years, if it's actually snake oil, you're nowhere. So I mean, I completely underline Christoph's emphasis point on where this needs to start.
Thanks. I'm gonna tell you, I hear every week a lot of BS as well. There are a lot of people that are coming because we do education, we do recruitment and linking people to each other. And some people are coming and say, I would like to start a startup. And I said, what do you have? We are thinking about filling a patent. There's nothing. Or some people saying, I would like to start a startup. Can you introduce me to someone who knows quantum, that we can work together on a startup? This is happening a lot. I don't want to close doors to anyone, because you never know what it can come out of that. But that's one thing that is happening because of the hype. And the other thing is that I think we need to realize that not everything can be commercially available. Not everything that is in the lab can be a product that it can be sold, that an investor would like to invest. So I just wanted to kind of share these two thoughts on this. But I wanted to go back there. We don't have much time, but go back to the point that Christoph mentioned before. So now we went from the lab, we grew, and now we are so big that we go public. What are your thoughts on what is happening with these companies? And I want to start with David here.
So I'm part of my life journey. If I elaborate on my CV, I was involved in companies that were private and ultimately went public, and so I saw some of that the way the narrative needs to be controlled and presented, and what a public company needs to do that's distinct. And one of the things that you have to really get used to if you're in a public company is you're presenting results quarter on quarter to a group of investors or analysts advising your investors. And it's crucial that you have a narrative that you can control, that you can explain in demonstrable ways what your business is about doing, what metrics matter to your business, and very often they're revenue-based metrics or metrics which are close surrogates for revenue. And you need to be able to demonstrate that story is working and continues to work in a relatively linear way. And ultimately that goes, what I was trying to talk about earlier, that backs off against your investors have a particular risk appetite that they're looking for. They don't want you to be operating in an environment which is way outside of that level of risk that they're used to. So they need you to be convincing them quarter on quarter that you remain in that steady envelope. And that narrative is difficult enough to maintain for a normal business. But if you're in a business where there are large uncertainties about how quickly revenues can come in, because there are, very much, and that puts you in a difficult position. So I think if you're in a quantum business that's looking to go in a public market or looking at how you can control your story in a public market, you have to be very cognizant of that. Are you really at the stage of development where you can so tightly control things? And I think it's a challenge that I think I wish all the best to the businesses which are already in that position. But I do think it's a real challenge for their executives to be able to do that. And clearly they need to be very cautious not to overpromise, because the market will come back and bite them.
Thanks. Emily, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's a challenging thing to do. And exactly like David said, this envelope that needs to be kept so tightly is very difficult to control. And I also think that it's very possible still at this stage to keep the envelope tight, but I don't think it necessarily reflects that it will remain tight in the future, so to say, just because, again, like the whole field is still in very, very early stages. It's very much dependent on technological breakthroughs coming out of academic environments. So a lot of things can change very quickly. And exactly like David was saying, if you're pulling together this narrative and sharing it publicly, you need to be able to account for potential changes and dynamics very quickly and be able to maintain a coherent story behind that. So I think it's a challenge. I also wish all the best. I don't know if it's really possible to be 100% sure if this is the right way to continue with your company at this point in time, because things are so nascent. But yeah, I think a lot of thought needs to be put in the narrative that's being crafted, and the fact that there might be differences between the narrative that's being shown and actually the science that lies behind it.
Thanks, Christoph. Anything to add before?
One thing I'd like to add, though, is it's fantastic that people can invest in quantum computing. Like everybody can invest. I mean, the fact that it's public and that gives everybody the possibility to be involved in the quantum economy, the quantum revolution, because it's definitely is one. The horizon is uncertain, as we said, but so far with venture capital, essentially people cannot invest in quantum in companies. I mean, it's very restricted, professional investors. So I think when I saw that these companies were going public last year, I think at first I felt like it's great because it will also democratize a little bit. I mean, we should work on that as well, because that's a good way to educate. There are pros and cons. On the pro side, I see that, bringing 500 million on your bank account in order to grow your company and get to scale, I think is not happening every day. So from this perspective, I think it's very positive, obviously. But all the points that David and Emily made are pretty true. I think it's all about the narrative and being sure, and that you have things to say every quarter to your investors, that the technology is progressing at the rate you're expecting, or you promised it to grow. That's challenging. It's not impossible. I want honestly, I think I want, like everybody, I guess, to believe that it will work, but it's definitely challenging. There are going to be bumps on the road for sure. One thing that's a bit sad, though, is that European companies, I mean, it's much more difficult to have this kind of scheme getting public through a SPAC in Europe for variety of reasons, or getting public at all for deep tech companies. And that's something also that authorities, that government should keep in mind. What are the opportunities for companies to get public, not necessarily next year, but even in 5 years? When you think of it, not obvious. I mean, how to get such companies get public, because ultimately they will have to, or they should, but how to do it, not obvious at all. And that's something challenging we should all collectively think about, because these companies will need to get public one way or another, or be acquired fully by other European companies. But that's exits matter. I mean, something has to happen at some point.
Thanks a lot for your thoughts on the three of you on this matter. Before we go to the questions from the public, I would like to ask you, at the end, we are in Quantum Eastern Europe today. So how do you see the ecosystem in Eastern Europe? And I'm going to show later, we saw the different startups that are happening now. I'm going to show this later on. So there are startups in Eastern Europe. It's not like it's a dormant ecosystem. But what else can happen? How do you see the growth? What are your thoughts on that? Christoph, can you start on this?
Yeah, so we've looked at a couple of opportunities in Europe in Eastern Europe over the years. So definitely it's an interesting space. Fundamental, well, from my perception, let's say very strong academics, especially on fundamental aspects, maybe a little bit less so on applied experiments, applied experimental physics, which is naturally leading to startups. So might be a little bit of a challenge there on where the science is focused at the moment, and how to turn it into startups. I think it's would be very interested in making investments in Eastern Europe. Definitely, I mean, there's nothing against that. Two challenging points, I think. First, I think it's better to have a VC, an established venture capital culture in the countries where you start a company. Because what we like to do, especially in geographies where we don't have expertise or experience, is also to syndicate, collaborate with other VCs, maybe less specialized, but who know about the subsidies, about the authorities, the tax implications, etc., etc. And we'd need, for us, speaking for me, but I'm pretty sure David will agree, we need to find co-investors, and there are not that many venture capitalists in the region. And I think that's a challenge. I think it's important to have generalist, deep tech oriented local VCs. There's a couple in Poland, I know, but that's something important in my view. And the second aspect is build ecosystems. I mean, a startup on its own in the middle of nowhere, is in more difficulty to connect with the broader world, not only with investors but with collaborators. Attractivity for the talents. I mean, there's definitely a challenge to attract people, to pay them competitive salaries in quantum, and that's through connections. Also, that's something that's needed. So connect to the rest of the world, build ecosystems, ask your governments to support that as well. I think that's also, in my view, important.
Thanks. I will ask you where we continue with Emily and David to answer directly on the chat, because I don't think we have time to go through the questions from the public. Thank you. Emily, would you like to add anything?
Yes. So we've also looked at some startups in Eastern Europe, especially in quantum. So I agree that I don't think the ecosystem is dormant. I think there are some leading technical universities, and there's some very good fundamental theoretical work that's being done. Like, it's very high quality science. I think one of the good things about quantum at the moment is you don't need to have hardware in front of you to have access to quantum computing. There's an enormous amount of work that needs to be done on the algorithms and software side. And we need help, like, all over the world to solve a lot of these problems. So I think there's a lot of scope to be doing stuff there. But yeah, it is a challenge if you don't have a support system around you immediately. And so I would encourage people to do as much reaching out as possible and talking to as many people as possible. I think the field is in a really lovely place at the moment because, you know, you're still very close to academia, which is an environment that fosters collaboration and usually, you know, opens questions and conversations with open arms. But you have this cusp of entrepreneurial side of things. And I think on that side too, people are usually very open and happy to have conversations and happy to hear what your idea is and talk about the challenges that they faced it. So I would say really, like, go knocking on as many doors as you can, like, get inspired by ecosystems that are a little bit more established and set up to see what you need to get the support system, and, you know, make it easier for people who want to do the same thing to you to commercialize and see what has to be done there. And yeah, I'm looking forward to see, like, lots of more startups coming out of the ecosystem. I don't have any doubts that there will be more coming.
Thanks. David, any thoughts?
Yeah, if I was a politician in Eastern Europe, I would really be looking to quantum as being a great and differentiated opportunity. You know, one of the reasons why people are interested globally around in quantum is what helped you succeed in the last generation of technology. It doesn't necessarily apply to this. So the advantage that Silicon Valley's had as a locus for the digital economy is not necessarily there, because it could be other technologies that drive this. And I think some of the technologies that are out there at the moment, leading architecture, leading machines, there are a lot more barriers to scaling up these technologies than I think is commonly appreciated. And so there's still a wide opportunity for regions to become a locus of activity in this economy. Eastern Europe's already got a number of globally notable businesses in the field, and some interesting emerging ones, particularly in the software side. And it has, and I think, you know, Christoph and Emily pointed to this, it's got that great academic tradition. And everyone talks about how talent is going to be a key driver in this. And it has that feed that can help support that. Exactly what centers can emerge, how that plays out, there's a very subtle dance, I think, that needs to be played now across the European Union and the wider European community about what centers can emerge for which parts of the value chain. But get that right. I think it could be a big opportunity for Europe. I think a significant opportunity for Eastern Europe in particular.
Thanks. We are getting close to the time. It's lunchtime now, so we can just spend the last 2 minutes. I would like any of you to share a quote or a message to the quantum community, to the quantum Eastern European community, but also in general, anything that you would like to say. This is the time. So let's start with David.
Well, I live, looking at the slide there, I live on that island off the edge of Europe. So I thought a boating analogy would be appropriate. So I think, quantum technology is a tide which is coming in, and there'll be waves that knock us up and down. But if you want to rise on the tide, you've got to be in a boat.
Love it. Emily?
I don't have a specific quote, but I want to point people to Richard Feynman, and not only because he did some disruptive and groundbreaking work in quantum physics, but also because he was fiercely curious. He's a very big inspiration for me in my life. So I think be curious, ask questions, keep on pushing the why. Be ready for the tide of waves that will come on of David's boat, quantum boat. But yeah, be like Richard Feynman, be curious. That's my takeaway.
Thank you. And Christoph?
Yeah, it's funny because I'm more or less along the same lines, I'd say. I think the thing I'd like to emphasize is quantum is getting into quantum for an entrepreneur is not really a race for me. It's really a journey. It will take time. It's hard. But at the end of the day, we're really, what's exciting me and many around me, I'm sure, is getting to transition the world into the quantum economy. How much time it will take? No clue, quite frankly. But I'm sure it will happen. And that's a beautiful journey to make together.
Thanks a lot. Thank you, Emily, Christoph, David. Fantastic discussion. And now it's time for lunch. We have around 1 hour. I will encourage you to visit the booths and also to network. We have this speed networking where you can have 5 minutes randomly with anyone. Just take your coffee and enjoy. See you soon. Thanks very much. Bye.